Lunch and Learns. This is an opportunity for everybody to kind of experience some of the courses and the topics that we cover in our unit as a non-credit program in different areas. And it's just, if you haven't gone through and seen everything, take a look, take a sample, as we have been saying, and enjoy. Some quick ground rules for today. Please keep yourself muted. Megan has said that she will take questions through the chat box as well as through the at different points. So primarily use the chat box today. It would be great. I'll let her give her own ground rules as she gets closer. Let's see what else. Oh, we are recording, like I said, so it will be distributed onto our website as well as to participants. So if you do skip out early or need to skip out, you can finish watching it as well or listening to it. That's pretty much it. And again, I don't want to take any time away from the topic. Once again, welcome, and we look forward to seeing you in more of our programming this summer and in the future. Megan, please go right ahead.
Hi, everybody. I'm Megan Oczkewicz. I'm going to be leading this session today about how to effectively close out your projects. Really great to see such a big crowd here today for this topic. I think it's one of those topics that we should be talking more about, and one of those things that as we get to the end of a project, sometimes we lose a little bit of steam, lose a little bit of energy, and we want to just walk away and be done and think, okay, we did that. Now let's move on to the next thing. But there are some things we need to put in place before we do that. So we're going to be talking a little bit about that today. But first, let me introduce myself. So I'm Megan Oczkewicz. I am a Lean Six Sigma black belt. I got my black belt through the University of Washington, Tacoma. If you haven't done that, I would highly recommend it. It was an awesome program. I have 7 years of process improvement experience working at the Washington State Healthcare Authority, about 12 years of state service. And then before I went into working at the Healthcare Authority, I did 15 years in fundraising. So just a little bit about me. I know this is a big group, but I still would love to hear just a little bit about you in the chat box. So if you could, in the chat, share your name, your organization, and what you do for your organization. I would just love to hear from a couple of you about that and hear who you are and who we've got here with us today. I know we've got 45 people, so I can't really go around and have you each unmute and do that. But if you could put that in the chat, that would be great. So your name, your organization, and what you do. That would be fantastic. And while we wait for some of those to come in, we'll talk a little bit about how today's going to go. We've got different sections we're going to talk through, some different tools for closing out projects and what those look like, and just some things to think about as we go into that final phase of a project. So we've got some coming in. We've got Christina Nguyen from Multicare. Welcome, Christina. We've got Alyssa from Washington Department of Health. Welcome. Melissa from the City of Auburn. Welcome. Sam from UW School of Medicine, Department of Medicine, welcome. Great. It looks like we've got people from all over the state, which is fantastic to see. Thank you so much for putting these in here. I love to see who's here. And welcome to all of you. I'm so happy that you decided to spend your lunch hour with us today. I know that can be a tough decision to make. So I appreciate you all being here with us. So you think you're done. So this is at the end of a project. You've led the project. It's time to close it out and transfer the work. If you're the process improvement on the project, maybe you're transferring that work back to the SMEs. Maybe you're one of the SMEs who's getting that work transferred back to you. But in some way, this transfer is happening where the project is closing down. We've made our improvements. We've worked with our project teams, and now it's time to move on to the next thing, perhaps. So today we're going to be talking about some tools that we can use to do this effectively. We're going to talk about some challenges and risks to closing out projects and how can we mitigate those. And then how often do we need to check back in on the work that we've done to ensure that that we're sustaining those gains that we made throughout the course of the project. And as a quick aside, so as we go through this, there's going to be time for questions at the end of this. If you have a question, though, I will be monitoring the chat. So feel free to put that question in the chat and I can answer it then as well. So a couple of ways. If you want to wait till the end, we can do questions then. But also if you've got something that's kind of nagging you and you want to ask it now, go ahead and put that in the chat. We can do that. So I want you to think about a project. And I want to think about a project that wasn't closed out as well as it could have been. What happened with that project? So this could have been maybe a project that you started that at the end of it, everybody was so exhausted. It was a big project and we were ready to move on to the next thing. So we just moved on to the next thing. Maybe we didn't do that closeout stuff as well as we feel we could have. What happened? Put in the chat if you can think of an instance when this happened to you. What happened when that was the case? I know I had one at the beginning of doing process improvement work where I was new to this. I had this large project and it was time to transfer the work back to the project team. And we were doing some work around a call center project and making sure those calls were answered timely. And we had put a new process in place for how that was going to work. And then at the end of the project, I didn't put some things in place that we're going to talk about today. And I was like, okay, they know that what they're supposed to be doing. It's great. We're now good to go. And I just walked away. And then when I checked back in with the group, maybe 2-3 months later, things had gone back to the way that they were because we hadn't necessarily put things in place to make sure that those gains were sustained. So when changes are made, people are sometimes uncomfortable with those changes. And if we don't put different things in place to make sure we're sustaining those, people are going to go back to the way that's comfortable doing the work. And it's not necessarily on them. It's really something that we need to make sure it's as easy as possible for the folks who are doing this new process to do the new process. So I know you probably have been thinking about this, but I also want you to think about a project that was closed out well. And then I want you to think about what the difference was, what you saw between a project that wasn't closed out as well as it could have been and a project that was, and how those gains were sustained with a project that was as opposed to the ones that wasn't. So just something to think about as we move into these topics. So one of the things that we can put into place that will help us as we move forward and as we're closing out projects and we're transferring the work back to the people who are doing the work, something called standard work. And when we're putting standard work in place, this is really to help us if we've made a change to a process, if we've created a new process, standard work is going to help the people who are doing that process know exactly what they're supposed to be doing in the most efficient way possible. So standard work could be something as simple as a desk manual. It could be a picture of the process, and it should show the most efficient and safest way to perform that particular process or task that we have done our process improvement on. It could also be a new process that we have put into place. And so it should be something that shows anybody coming into that new process exactly how that process should be performed, exactly how they should, the safest, most efficient way to do that work. This is not set in stone. So once we put a desk manual into place, and I've seen this happen where a new person will start a job and they say, well, I have a desk manual, but it was written 10 years ago. Those aren't very helpful because I'm sure over the course of 10 years that work has adjusted, it's shifted as work does. And so they need to be continually improved and updated as we improve the processes. This is not something that we do once and then we set it aside and say, okay, that's done. We've got that now. It's something we need to be continually looking at. And it should include the details that are pertinent to the process. So the time needed for each task, what the materials needed for each task, where handoffs occur. And also, it's very nice to see this, and it can be either in a written description or a picture or both. And we'll see some examples here in a moment. So having standard work in place helps reduce the variation with the process, and it increases our consistency. And in Lean Six Sigma, if you've had any training in Lean Six Sigma, that's what we're really working to do with Lean Six Sigma. We're trying to reduce variation when we perform a task, and we're trying to increase our consistency with that task. And all of this is in order to better serve our customers at the end of the day. So we put this standard work in place to really help make sure that we're consistent in what we're doing so that our customers are receiving a consistent product. Now, the importance of this. So it stops a process improvement effort from backsliding. So if we have something in place that can show, here's exactly how this should be performed, it eliminates any questions that employees may have as they go into working this new process. And so they're less likely, they still might, but they're less likely to go back to that old comfortable way of doing things. They now have this standard work manual or picture, whatever that looks like, that shows them exactly how this should be performed, and it helps them then do that moving forward. It ensures that the momentum of our project that we have worked so hard on and achieved is sustained. And it sets us up for our next improvement effort. So when we're doing process improvement work, sometimes also called continuous improvement, it's called that for a reason. It's something we want to continuously improve. So just because we finish one piece of the project, it means that we're now ready for the next phase, the next piece, the next improvement. And then as we have new employees coming in, having standard work in place, having something documented of here's how this works really helps plug that new employee in and helps them hit the ground running. So it really helps us train new employees in optimal ways to complete the tasks. So some examples of standard work. So this is a very simple example from Six Sigma that shows, and I say simple, but actually it's quite complicated, but it shows just a picture of how whatever they're making works its way through the assembly line, if you will. It shows where the different operators are, and it shows sort of what their area is. It shows also where quality checks happen throughout the process. It also tells us how long this process takes and how much, the WIP stands for work in progress, how many things they're working on at once, which is at max 26. So this gives us some really good pertinent information. If you were new to the job or trying to figure out, okay, now what do we do here? I know we just changed this. You could take a look at this and it gives you a nice clear picture of what you're supposed to do next. We have I work for the Washington State Healthcare Authority, and we have a process improvement room there. When we were in person, we did a lot of process improvements in that room, and we would also let others use that room. But we had a picture tacked up around the room that showed how we wanted our room set up for us. So basically, it was standard work for here's what the room needs to look like when we're leading a process improvement. And what that did was anybody who was using our room, who was a guest in our room, then knew how to put it back so that it would be ready for us to do the next process improvement project. And that's just another example of a standard work picture. Again, makes it very easy for someone to come in and know exactly what's expected and what we're hoping they'll do. And here's another example. This shows the activity here. So they list out the different steps. They list out the time each step takes and the key points. So what we're looking for at each of the steps. And then you can also add a flow chart. So if you've got folks who are better at looking, they want to see the step-by-step written down. So, a desk manual or a process document, something like that, this would benefit them. But then you have other folks who want to see it in a more visual picture format. And so by doing both, you give that to the different learners, you give them exactly what they need to be efficient and effective in their jobs. Now, if you Google standard work, you will probably find, I would guess, probably over 100 different templates. None of them are wrong. It's whatever's going to work best for you and your project. The important part is before you close out a project, putting something like this in place, again, to help sustain those gains and to help make sure that when we're transferring that work back to the people who are going to be doing the process or training people on how to do the process, they have something they can refer to see, okay, here's the most efficient way to do this. Here's how much time this should be taking me. And here are the key points. Here's why we're doing this activity. And so once we get our standard work in place, another piece that we want to do is a control plan. So again, at the end of a project, just because we close it doesn't mean it's necessarily over. And the control plan is one part of ensuring the gains are maintained. So just like the standard work, this is going to help us ensure that if we've got this in place, this is something we can go to and look at to make sure that we're not backsliding with our projects. And we're going to be looking at different things with a control plan than we do with standard work. So where standard work is all about, here's how the process should be performed, the control plan is looking at, here's the measurements we're going to take to make sure that the process is performing the way it's supposed to. Here's when we're going to take those measurements. And then if those measurements show us that we have somehow gotten out of control from where we want to be, here's what we're going to do to readjust and to monitor. So that is what a control plan does. That's what we're hoping it will do. Now, the how-to. So we want to make sure with a control plan, we're including all of the relevant information it takes to ensure the gains are sustained. So there can be long-term action items on these. There can be, it's really important to list what we're going to be measuring and what that looks like. And the list needs to be updated and followed by the process owners. And those are the people who are actually working within the process until those action items are complete. So if you are the one who was the process improvement person who led the project, and then you're handing it back to the process owner, It's your job as the person who led the process improvement project to be checking in with those process owners, but the process owners are the ones who are then taking on those action items and ensuring those are getting completed. So even after we deem a project complete, we need to make sure that we're following up. And it's nice to have a control plan to show us what we're supposed to be looking at when we follow up. Shows us what we're going to measure, shows us what that looks like. And then the follow-up is done also with those process owners. And then adhering to the details of the control plan will standardize these efforts and allow quick analysis of current performance. So we can look at the control plan, we can see how we're performing, how our process is performing, and then we can look at it and say, okay, are we within the boundaries that we want to be for this process? And if yes, great, we will go ahead and check in again in a month or 2 months or whatever the project team has said they would, how often they said they'd like to check in. If we're off track, we have on that control plan also talked through what we will do if we are off track and what that looks like. Let's look at some examples of these as well. So this is one I actually did for, I believe, my Greenbelt project when I took Greenbelt. And my control plan was all about, my project was about communications around our employee engagement survey, and which is a survey that's done every year for state employees. And I had these different milestones that I was looking for, these different specifications. So I knew that in August, my specification that I was trying to hit was that 100% of communications set for this time period were sent per our communications plan. And then I asked, then I asked myself, okay, for all the communications for August per the communications plan. So that was my frequency. My sample size was all about the communications plan. And this was going to be checked by the EOC design team, which is our employer of choice design team at HCA. So going down and listing out all of these, when am I going to check in? What am I looking for when I check in? Did I hit that 100% mark? And then who's going to be checking it? So I coupled this with this, which was a simple decision tree that can also be a piece of your control plan that tells me what I'm going to do if I'm off track and what I'm going to do if I'm on track. So the question is communications occurring per the communications plan? If the answer is yes, we're going to carry on with the plan until our next check-in. If the answer is no, then we go down that no path and we set a meeting with the EOC design team. We reference the communications plan and see where the disconnect is happening, identify issues and perform root cause analysis, update that communications plan, and then carry on with the adjusted plan until the next check-in. In my mind, the most important part of a control plan is having something, it doesn't have to be a decision tree, but something like this that tells us what we're going to do if we're off track. What we're going to do if we've backslid a little bit, or if we're not hitting the mark that we said we were going to hit. What are we going to do? How are we going to evaluate that? How are we going to move forward? And just having a plan in place that we've talked with our project teams about and gotten them on board with, so that we know if we're a little off track, that's okay, that happens. But here's what we're going to do to make sure we can get back on track as quickly as possible. So that's the importance of the control plan, and it can really go hand in hand with that standard work. So we put that standard work in for the folks doing the process. The control plan then is that piece where we're checking to see how that standard work is it actually accomplishing what we need it to, or do we need to make some adjustments? Because just because we put it into place doesn't mean, again, that it's set in stone. There are oftentimes little adjustments we need to make to these things to make sure it's working correctly. And the next thing we're going to talk about is a RACI. And actually, right before I came here, I was working on a RACI with a group. We do a lot of these at the Healthcare Authority. A RACI is a great way to define roles and responsibilities. In a project closeout, it's a really nice thing to do if you have adjusted roles and responsibilities amongst the team that does the process. This can help lay out who's responsible for what and really take a look at those roles and making sure that we have those correct. I've got somebody who said RACIs are my faves. Great. Yes, we love them as well. So it's a matrix. And this is really designed to define clear roles and responsibilities for a team. The one I'm doing that I was just working on with the team before I came here, they actually were able to add a new staff member to their team. And they are a team of, I think, 6 who are doing the work that a team of 15 should probably be doing. But they were able to add a new staff member. And so now they really need to look at each of the tasks that they perform with this new staff member in mind and decide, okay, how can we adjust the work so that not everything is on this one person's plate and we can spread around the who's responsible for the work a little bit better. So RACI is an acronym that stands for responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed. And so when we look at who's responsible, when we say that in the context of a RACI, what we're saying is this is the person who is actually doing the work to achieve the task. This is the person who's doing that work. Now, the person who's accountable, this is the person who is ultimately accountable for the task getting completed. And what that means, usually in my mind, and the way I describe it is, if the person who's responsible for the work, let's say they don't do it or they drop the ball, the person who's accountable is the person that they're going to go to say, hey, this didn't happen. So a lot of times that's a manager, that could be an executive leader. And so the accountable party is that person who's they may not be responsible for doing the work. They're not the ones actually doing the work, but they're the ones who people are going to go to if something is not done correctly. And then we have the C for consulted. This is a subject matter expert who we need to talk to provide ideas and information. This can be a very important role to define because these are usually the folks who we need to go to in order to make sure that our work gets completed. So the person responsible needs to work closely with anybody listed as a C on the RACI in order to make sure that the work gets done. And then informed means they need to be kept in the loop. They don't necessarily have a role larger than that. They just need to know that it happened. So in a project closeout situation, if we have shifted a process, if we've improved the process, whatever we've done, or if we've implemented a new process, putting a RACI in place can really help the staff members who are involved in that process have a very clear understanding of what they're responsible for, what they're accountable for, who they need to consult with in order to get their work done, and then who they need to keep in the loop. So let's take a look at what one of these looks like, and it's going to look kind of small. This is from the same example as the control plan. This is a RACI I put into place for that survey communication. And as you can see here, so we talked through these different, we've got categories listed here. So the different categories are pre-survey, during the survey, and then not on the screen was post-survey. And then the different functions, tasks, and activities are then listed out. And you can get as in detail as you want with these. Some groups want to list out every little thing they do, and that's okay because it's going to be whatever is going to be most helpful for that group, whatever is going to be most helpful going forward. And some keep it higher level, and that's okay too. It's going to be whatever is going to be most useful for that team. And then what we do is we go line by line, and we want to make sure that we have a representative from each of these roles in the room when we do one of these. So for the roles for this one, we had communications, planning and performance. We had our employer of choice design team, our employer of choice work group, and then our executive leadership team. And so as we walked through each of these and we said, okay, we're going to draft and review the communications plan. And we talked about, okay, who's actually going to do that? Who's responsible for that task? That was communications, so they get an R. Who's accountable for that getting done? That was planning and performance. They got an A. Who do we need to consult with in order to get this work done? That was the design team and the work group. And then our executive leadership team just needed to be informed that this was put into place, that we do have a plan for the upcoming year. So you go line by line. And as you can see, not everybody has a role with every task, and that's okay. Something to keep in mind with this, we want to make sure that we don't have too many people responsible for a task. That was something the group I was working with a little earlier was having a hard time with. They wanted to have 4 people responsible for a task. And what happens when we do that is there can still be some role confusion. Because if there are 4 people, and if I'm one of those people, and I know Sarah Lynn's another one of those people, I may think, well, Sarah Lynn did this. I don't need to worry about it. She's responsible for it. And she may be thinking, well, no, Megan did it. Megan's the one who's responsible for it. So it's really nice to be clear on that and get really down into that nitty gritty. Who's actually going to do the work? So maybe I'm responsible to do the work, but I'm going to consult with Sarah Lynn and she's going to pull some pieces together for me. But I'm the one who's ultimately going to be turning that work in, sending that work forward. So I would be the responsible party. And same with accountable. We want to make sure that really we try to only have one accountable party for each one of these as well, for the same reason. And so if you find yourself wanting to give more than one accountable party, what I usually say is you may need to go up another level. So if you've got a couple of managers on here and you think, well, both of the managers are accountable, I would then probably ask, well, who's their manager? And they're probably the one that then is ultimately accountable. So again, this can be a really great tool when we're closing out a project, just to make sure everybody's clear as to what they're responsible for in this new process and who's accountable, and then who we need to consult and who we need to keep in the loop. I love a good RACI. And we do a lot of them. And you can make them look pretty like I've done here with color coding. A lot of times if we're moving fast and furious with these, we don't worry about color coding them. We just have the R's, the A's, the C's, and the I's in the boxes, and that's fine too. And then we come to, and this is another one of my favorites, although a lot of these are my favorites, but 30, 60, 90-day check-ins. When we close out a project, we are not done. We still need to make sure that we are checking in with our project teams for every 30 days for the first 3 months. And a lot of times we go past the 90-day check-in if the group wants us to. Because what we found is project teams like to have a 30 minutes check-in once a month just to make sure that, hey, we're closing out any action items that are open, checking in on our control plans, checking in on our standard work, making sure that that is still accurate and what we need to have in place. These are just great ways to get everybody back together. They don't have to be really long. Maybe they are at first, like the 30-day check-in might be a little longer than the 90-day check-in or 120-day check-in. But as we go along, it's just a nice way to touch base, make sure we're not forgetting about this work, make sure that we're keeping it in our brains a little bit and checking in on what still needs to be done. So again, you still need to check in after a project is closed out. So as you wrap up your project, you'll want to set these check-in meetings with the project team once a month for at least the first 3 months. They're called 30, 60, 90-day check-ins just because we check in at 30 days, we check in at 60 days, we check in at 90 days after our project close out. They can be anywhere from 30 minutes to an hour, depending on the work that needs to be done. Again, in that 30-day check-in, I usually make those for an hour. They don't always go for an hour. It just depends on what the group needs to talk about and what they still need to work through. And then by the 90-day check-in, we're usually down to about a 30-minute meeting. So an agenda for these. We usually will do action item review. So we'll review all open action items with the project team. We'll make sure we're getting those updated. We'll talk about next steps. Then we'll update and close out any action items that we can. We ask for roadblocks and challenges. And this is a really important part of those meetings because as we have seen, I'm sure with our projects, things happen, things come up. We hit roadblocks, we hit people who maybe are resistant that we weren't expecting them to be resistant. There could be unforeseen challenges that pop up. And so we ask the question, has the group had any setbacks? Are there any new roadblocks the team needs to be aware of? If the answer is yes, then we spend some time really talking through those and diving into those and adding some action items around those. How are we going to handle these? If we've had some new resistance pop up, what are we going to do about that? What's our plan for that? It's important to have that space and time to have these conversations as we're working to really implement and ensure that our gains are sustained. And then this is also where we're going to check in on that control plan. So have we looked at what we said we're going to measure? How are we doing? Are we on track? Has there been backsliding? If there's been backsliding, okay, let's then look at what our plan is for if that's happening. And then we're going to talk through some action planning around who's going to implement that plan that we had put into place in the control plan. So these can be extremely beneficial. And I would recommend for any project you've closed out to really put some check-ins on the calendar. Again, if for no other reason, just to ensure that this doesn't get completely out of sight, out of mind. And this just puts us back it puts it back into our brains once a month for us to really look at those action items, make sure that we're completing those, make sure that we're still moving forward and we're sustaining that momentum that we gained through this project. It's also where we can talk about, okay, what's our next process improvement going to be? So if this one's going great, okay, what are we going to do next? What do we want to work on next? What else has popped up that we now see that we need to work on? And so these can be a great place for that as well. And then we have communication plans. There's not enough words, I don't think, to communicate how important a communication plan is, not just at the closeout of your project, but throughout the life of your project. Communication is key throughout the entire thing. And just because the project is officially closed out doesn't mean that we stop communicating. I once was talking to a communication person that I work with, and they said this thing that has always stuck with me, which is we feel like we are communicating a lot. We feel like, okay, we've told people the same message in 10 different mediums, 15 different ways, but really, it's not until we feel like if we have to say it one more time, we might throw up, that it starts to sink in for the person who's hearing the message. So we may be so tired of communicating about this and we think we've done this, we've communicated as much as we possibly can. It might just then be sinking in with somebody because I always have to remind myself that just because I'm focusing so much time on this project doesn't mean that someone else who maybe wasn't on the project team, but is going to have a role in the process has been focusing as much of their time on it. They probably have 15, 20 other things that they're doing on top of this. And this is just a piece of it. And so we always have to keep that in mind and keep communicating throughout that life of your project. And we need to ensure we've identified at the end of our project who we still need to keep in the loop and how we're going to do that and how often we're going to do that. And something that helps with that can be a very simple communication plan template. This doesn't have to be complicated. It doesn't have to be very in depth. It can just be something very simple that we talk through with our project teams, and we talk about what's the purpose of the communication. What are the key messages that we need to make sure are in that communication? Who's the stakeholder and group we need to make sure we're communicating with? What format are we going to communicate with them? Do they prefer email? Do they prefer a Teams message? Do they prefer getting together for a quick meeting? Who's the owner of that communication? And by owner, I mean, who's going to actually do that communication? We want to make sure we've assigned that so it doesn't drop. And then by what date do we want to make sure that communication goes out? So again, something like this should be in place throughout the life of your project, but just because your project is closed out doesn't mean we need to stop communicating about it. This is really where we need to kick that communication into high gear, make sure we're still communicating with our stakeholders, still making sure that they're hearing about those gains that we have made with the process or improvement or whatever we've done with our project, that they're still getting that message that this is what's happened, this is how it's working, and that we have those messages in place and we have a plan for who's going to deliver them. So those are just some quick tools that you can use when you're closing out a project. We talked about standard work and how important that is, and really making sure we have that standard work in place, having those control plans in place, knowing what we're measuring once we've closed out our projects, knowing what that looks like, and most importantly, with that control plan, knowing what we're going to do if we're off track. We talked about those RACIs, which I love a good RACI, but really defining those roles and responsibilities for our project, for the group that's going to be taking that work forward. So they know what they're responsible for, what they're accountable for, what they need to be consulted on, and what they need to be informed about. And then also those 30, 60, 90-day check-ins, how important those can be to make sure we're checking in on all of this work that's happening, and then putting a good communication plan into place. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to all of you for any questions you may have. And I'd love to hear your questions. If you want to put them in the chat, that would be great. And we're going to open it up for that right now.
And Megan, I'm going to put in a poll here for
Great.
responses from people as well, just to see kind of how today went for them. So that'll just be in the background while people are answering questions.
Awesome. Thank you. So any questions folks have about this? I know we went through it quickly. It's a lot of information in a short period of time. But what questions do you have? What challenges have you been through when you've been trying to close out projects? Would love to hear from you.
Actually, I have one for you. And since I was talking, this is Christopher again. So with the RACI, which I said I love, there are points, and this has come up in when I took the class, can you have somebody be responsible and accountable at the same time? And how does that work? And how do you divide that out?
We had that discussion this morning, actually, in the group I was working with. And yes, you can. It's not, I would say it's not preferable. I'd always like those to be two separate roles. But sometimes they're not. Sometimes the person who's doing the work is also the person who's accountable for the work. And that's okay. And so what we do when that's the case is we would put an R and an A in the box. And that just shows us that they're responsible and accountable. But I would always ask the question of the group as I'm leading one of those and really push back on that just to make sure that that's really the case. Because sometimes people think, well, I'm also accountable. And that's why I give that example. Okay, but if you don't do the work and something happens to the work, well, who are they going to go to complain? And if it's still you, then yeah, you're probably the accountable party. But if it's not you, we want to talk about who that person would be. Does that answer your question, Chris?
That's great. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
It's like Sarah Lynn has one too.
Yeah, so how detailed should a RACI be? Every task or just larger buckets of responsibility? I always leave that up to the project team. And because it's going to be whatever's most helpful to your project team. So I tend to side on somewhere in the middle. We want enough tasks on there that's going to be very, very helpful for somebody who's looking at it to see what they're responsible for. But if we get down into that nitty gritty and every little thing is listed, it could be a monstrous document that's not going to be able to be reviewed very easily. So somewhere in the middle of that, so where we have larger buckets of responsibility, and then where we need to, we can break those out if we're finding there's some confusion around roles around those different buckets of responsibility. Thanks, Sarah Lynn. And then Jessica says, I love the reminder to keep communicating the message. It does seem like overkill sometimes, but we have to account for busy schedules, lack of email reading, lack of interest, etc. Always great to say it one more time. Yes, Jessica, I couldn't agree more. There are times where I feel like, oh my gosh, they should know this by now, right? We've talked about this, we've talked about it, they should know, but they're busy and they don't have the same energy around it that we do. We've been so immersed in it that we forget that not everybody is. Great point. Thanks, Jessica. Cami asked, do you have suggestions for multi-phase projects that don't have strong closing segments? Yeah, so for projects that are multi-phase, that you know you're going into the next piece, I would still recommend putting in some sort of control plan to check in on that first phase. It doesn't have to be super advanced. It doesn't have to be super involved, but something to know if we're not necessarily closing it out, but we're moving into the next thing. How are we going to check in on that first thing we accomplished? And again, it could just be a very simple, we're going to have 30, 60, 90-day check-ins on that first phase while we work on the next phase to just ensure that we're not losing track of what we did in that first phase. It could also be as simple as having an action plan in place. It's a running list action plan and making sure you're checking in on those at every team meeting you have, even as you move into the next segment of the project. It doesn't have to be anything super advanced, but yeah, it's important to continue to check on those, even if there aren't those strong closing, like you don't have a big closing party or anything like that. You're just moving into the next improvement or the next segment of the project. Still nice to have something that you can check in to make sure that those gains that we made in that first segment are sustained. Whether that's through having a control plan, an action plan, whatever that looks like, we want to just make sure we're checking in on the work. Then Sean said, it seems like some of these tools would have been used within the active project too, not just closeout, correct? Yes. Yeah, a lot of times these tools can be used throughout the course, like the communication plan, again, should be used throughout the entire project. A RACI can be used at a few different points in a project. It doesn't necessarily just have to be for closeout. I have found that some projects that I have worked on, we've had to do a RACI in the middle somewhere because as we're process mapping, there's some confusion around who's doing what, and we see that. So we start to put together a RACI to do that work with the group. So yeah, they're great tools for closeout, but they can also be used at different stages as well. Thanks for that question, Sean. And then we've got a question from Chris. Do you have any preferred resources for templates or specific software tools? Yeah, so i6 Sigma, which is a website, i6sigma.com, has a lot of different templates and of these tools that you can use. I've created a lot of my own templates, and so I will look at what's online, and then I'll make it work for me, work for my project team. None of these tools are set in stone, so if there's something that you want to shift or adjust on them, make your own. And so a lot of the templates that I use today, I made myself. And so just looking at stuff on i6 Sigma, asq.com has some really great tools as well that you can look at. And a lot of times I'll just Google image search for different templates and see what comes up and then create my own based on what comes up. And Sean says, thanks. I usually do the RACI right from the start and make roles and responsibilities super clear. Yeah, that's great, Sean. It's a nice thing to start with as well, because it can help people see, okay, we now have a very clear understanding of who's doing what. Now let's move into the process. And then after you finish the process and you're closing out, it might be a good idea to just revisit that to see, does this still hold true given the work we've done around the process? Great point. Excellent questions. Any other questions or comments? I always like to pause here for an uncomfortable amount of time.
I can do a good plug for the upcoming sessions. So
yes, please.
Actually, next week we have 2 more free lunch and learns. On June 8th, there's the benefits triad for HR related. And on June 9th, there's the project management, applying an equity lens in project management. It's sort of the short introduction to a longer workshop that we offer later this year, which summer, which will be July 21st for the longer workshop. Oh, and you have a question, see?
Thank you for that. So will you recommend verbal peer feedback? I'm not sure I understand the question. I'm wondering, can I unmute Kaja to give me some more information, or is that not, can I not do that?
I think I can. Let me go ahead and find Kaya.
And Kaya, sorry to put you on the spot. Yeah,
Hi.
so the website, go ahead.
I'm here. Hi.
Yes, hi.
Hi, I'm Kaja. My question is, so we are working in a team. So at the end of the project, should we give each other feedback onto, okay, how did each person perform in their role? If maybe this person could have been good in another role as opposed to this role. So, just to figure out where our strength were as a team and where our weaknesses and stuff like that.
Yeah, I think that can be a really great exercise to do at the end of a project. You could also call that something like lessons learned and really kind of talk about, we just finished, either it's a phase of the project or the full project. What worked well, what didn't, what lessons did we learn? What could we do better next time? And get at some of those same kind of that peer feedback as well. So what roles worked well, and asking and doing a lessons learned closeout can be really helpful at the end of a project as well, especially if you're going to be going right directly into another project. It's always nice to see what we could do better next time and what worked well, so that we don't always have to recreate the wheel. So yeah, I think that's a great idea, Kaja. Thank you for that. And I see Sarah Lynn put the websites in, Melissa, for you. Thank you, Sarah Lynn, for doing that. Any other questions or thoughts? All right, so I think I'm going to wrap it up here. And if there's other questions, feel free to email me. I'm happy to answer any questions. Oh, I've got one here from Cami. Yep. I have been trying to set up standard work documents for the current phase for one of my projects, but there's so much variation with each end product. Do you have suggestions on documenting processes that have so much flexibility? Yeah, that can be difficult, especially if there's, it could go a million different ways depending on, I always think of like call centers. If a question from a provider or a customer comes in, that question could be 35, 40 different things. And so how do we document that in standard work? And I think what I've seen done is either a decision tree, again, that takes you down all those different pathways, which I know can be a lot of work to put into place, but once it's in place, it is something that's extremely useful for the team. I've also seen those desk manuals where they really do, they list out, here are all of the possibilities that can happen, and here's what we do with each of those possibilities. Again, a lot of work to put into place, but once you get it in place, it's something that's going to be useful for a long time that you're only going to have to make minor adjustments to. So yeah, Cami, that would be my recommendation, is to go down that rabbit hole and really list out all of those different things that could happen, because hopefully you'll only have to do it once. And then from there, you'll be able to make adjustments to it and not have to redo the whole thing. Oh, good. Yeah, thank you for that question. All right, well, I think we're going to wrap up. Chris, I'm going to toss it back to you.
No, that sounds great. Thank you very much. And thank you all for attending today. Again, this is the first of our series over the summer. And actually, Sarah Lynn has a great question for you to talk about you a little bit. What classes do you teach here at UW?
So I, this past year, taught in the CPM course, which is the Certified Public Manager. I should know the name of the course, the Certified Public Manager course, which is a year-long course at UW Tacoma in the PDC. And then I also am going to be teaching my first green belt for UW coming this fall. So very excited about that as well. Thanks, Sarah Lynn.
Yeah, we're very glad to have you. Thank you so much. And yeah, it's great. We have a lot of great instructors like Megan, a lot of great courses. And we look forward to seeing you in some of them later on this summer and throughout the year. Please reach out to us if you have any other questions. And like I said, we'll post this and get it out to you. And have a great afternoon. Enjoy the weather. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.